When Dr. Mary Wilde's sons were younger, she had a couple of great climbing trees in her front yard.
The branches were really stair-steppy, so you could get really high in these trees. And sometimes my boys would climb up and sway in the breeze on these trees, and it just scared me.
A pretty normal response, and there's a reason our body gives us this signal of fear.
We have stress and a stress response and a sympathetic nervous system for a reason. It's for survival, and it's our friend. But there's a certain point after which it becomes unhelpful and unhealthy. And so it's recognizing what percent or degree of this do you want and need to hold on to? And then what can you let go of?
Back to those boys in the trees, Mary had a choice to make.
I had to ask myself, do I want my kids to have a sense of adventure and exploration? Do I want boys who climb trees? And so at some points, I just chose to look away. I chose just to be there, but just not stop them. But then there are other times when I have intervened and said, no.
This is the How She Moms podcast with Whitney Archibald. I'm a mother of 5 on a mission to help moms connect with your kids, manage your homes, and create your own unique version of motherhood. I curate ideas from different moms so you can pick and choose what works for you and your family. I've been meaning to do an episode about kids and anxiety for a long time, but I've always felt a little bit like an imposter because, honestly, anxiety is not something I really have much experience with either myself or my kids. Which is why I was very careful to find a guest who is qualified to talk about it. Dr. Mary Wilde is just the woman I was looking for. She not only has firsthand experience with anxiety herself, but she's also an integrative pediatrician who specializes in behavioral health, specifically helping children with anxiety and ADHD. And she has 8 sons, several of whom have also experienced anxiety. Mary offers a wealth of resources for both parents and kids who struggle with anxiety. Just this week, she gave a free masterclass about empowering anxious kids, which you can still access at the link I'll provide in the show notes. She also runs a resilience program for kids, does group and individual consultations, and hosts a podcast called Compassion Parenting. You can access all of that at drmarywilde.com. I'll also include a link to Mary's TED Talk, which she'll mention a little later. When I asked Mary to help me understand anxiety, she started with a flashback.
Until I did my own training and professional work, I actually didn't realize how anxious of a kid I was. And it was as an adult that I did more of this inner work. And then it made me really want to help other kids not have to be held back and stuck by anxiety. But then, becoming a mom too, that brings a whole new level of anxiety. So yes. I definitely do want to get to that. But I think it can be helpful to just kind of look back at our own kind of anxiety timeline and say, what are those moments that impacted how I grew up and how I thought about the world? And for me, there were a couple things. I have always been afraid of deep water. I'm afraid of swimming. And in some ways, this is something that has helped me relate to my patients because I can say to them, can you swim? And usually they're like, yeah, I can swim. And then I can say to them, you are way ahead of me in this area. Now let's work on the area that you need to have a little help in, but just to help them feel like a realization of their own mastery and bravery in an area that is terrifying to me. So I had a scary experience when I was taking swimming lessons as a little kid, and my teacher, because I was more hesitant and that was more my personality, thought it would be helpful to drop me off the diving board into the deep water.
Oh boy.
And it was very traumatic, and I did not get back in deep water until I was an adult, ever.
Wow.
And so I think that can kind of show us that the idea of, just face your fears, jump in, sometimes it works and sometimes it really doesn't and can cause trauma if it's pushed too quickly. So that was one thing. And then another moment I remember from my childhood is I was cast as the Tin Man in our school play of The Wizard of Oz. And so I was supposed to sing a solo, If I Only Had a Heart. And the piano played the intro, and I just didn't sing. I just froze. And she played the intro again, and I just like stood there and I could not make my voice work. So the idea of performance anxiety,
Oh, I want to
has
give little
been
Mary a hug.
yes. And so many times our kids, like, they have experiences like this, and then they turn inward and they stop trying because it's just safer
Yeah.
to retreat. And so using that introduction, I just will talk a little bit about the state of anxiety is typically when we overestimate risk and underestimate resources. And so unfortunately, the way we try to solve it often, both as kids and then as parents of kids, is we try to shrink the risk. We try to, as kids, we stop trying. We avoid things. We don't go out for the school play. We don't try out for that team. We don't go talk to that person who we wish was our friend. And then we can keep our anxiety smaller. It's like a ratio, like risk over resources equals anxiety,
Yes.
And so a lot of times as kids, we don't even see the resources that are really available to us, or sometimes we just actually haven't learned certain tools and practices that will help us feel more resourced. That's like a big summary of my work with kids and families, is to help them reverse their approach, that it's not trying to shrink the world, shrink the things that they try and are exposed to, but it's to expand the resources. And so I have a resilience program that teaches over 20 evidence-based tools to build resources and help kids learn to see the resources around them. And also a big part of my program is helping to coach parents to stop over rescuing, because instead of trying to like pad all the corners and buffer every discomfort, we need to help our kids realize that we believe in them and we see their strength and that they are capable.
And it seems like that kind of an approach where you are padding everything and minimizing risk, it kind of communicates to your child that the world is a dangerous place that needs to be modified.
Yes. And so there's this quote, there are all these quotes floating around, and who knows if they're accurately attributed.
Right.
A quote that has been attributed to Einstein, this idea that one of the biggest questions to answer in life is whether the universe is a friendly place. And I think that sometimes we communicate to our kids that it's not, and we have to decide that for ourselves as parents. How do I want to show up, and how do I want to communicate to my kids about their relationship with the world,
Yes. Oh, I love this. Okay. A lot of that protection and, metaphorical bubble wrapping of our children is because we're anxious and nervous about the world as it appears for our children, right? So what can we do to calm our own anxieties about parenting specifically?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just the main thing to start with is to recognize our job is different than we thought. It's not to secure the continual comfort and happiness of our children.
Yes.
Really, we are wanting them to grow and to be in a position where they can grow. And just like with exercise, we don't grow when we don't practice, and often practice against some resistance.
Yeah.
And so not being afraid of that. And so that is a huge shift for a lot of parents, because all of our well-meaning bubble wrapping comes from love. It comes from devotion and dedication, but it's so exhausting. And it's actually like sabotaging our greatest wish for our kids. And so the first step is to really flip that and recognize that every time a child protests, cries, expresses discontent, it's not necessarily like a summoning for us to come and fix things.
Yeah. What do we do if we feel that panicky feeling? Say we're at the playground and our kid's just doing normal kid stuff, climbing up the jungle gym or whatever, and we feel this panic, and maybe we can even recognize that it's not rational. Maybe we can recognize that this is just part of being a child and scraped knees and, that kind of thing. But what do you do in the moment if you're feeling this panic and you want to jump in and rescue?
Yes. Well, I think that the first step is to really honor our mom intuition, because and that can be confusing sometimes, because sometimes it's hard to sort out, like to really discern, is this like specific intuition about this particular circumstance, or is just this like random overarching fear about the universe that I have to work through, and so I think that a few different tools that we can use in the moment are to kind of do a little gut check, to just check in to feel like, does this feel like a specific kind of warning that I need to do something and intervene, or does it feel more like just based on my own issues, And so sometimes we can do that check pretty quickly. And then a couple questions to ask ourselves would be, as I look around, are other reasonable parents that I trust allowing their kids to do this? That's not, we can't always rely on what other people are doing, because our individual experiences and insight, our knowledge of our child, do give us a particular wisdom about when to intervene and when not to.
Right.
However, it can be helpful, because that's what I kind of have to do sometimes, like around water, with taking my kids to the swimming pool. Like if I am feeling like I have to be at my child's hip every second, and they're like 10, that's probably my problem. And, rather than issue with water safety. But on the other hand, I did notice that as a pediatrician, and like having awareness that there are drownings and near drownings, and I've seen them in the ICU and things like that, like I sometimes am shocked by how cavalier people are with little kids in water. So it's like, it's a balance. It really is a balance between like sifting through our own story and anxiety history, sifting through like specific inspiration or intuition that is helping us parent our child, and then also asking ourselves, like, is this something that I want for my child on the other end of this activity? And we can't protect our kids from everything. And even if we were to say, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can never do this, we can't control what happens. Like, we have to kind of befriend this idea that we are not in control. Yeah. So we have to try to be wise, but yet think, do I want my child to have a sense of independence? Do I want my child to learn from mistakes? Do I want my child to have an exploring spirit? And so it's balancing all these things.
Well, and that relationship between control and anxiety is an interesting thing to explore, isn't it?
Yes.
I feel like that might be part of what's at the heart of it. Is trying to control things that aren't under our control. And that disconnect naturally produces this uneasy feeling that we call anxiety. Right. Is that a correct characterization?
I think so. And recognizing too that anxiety, we use that word and it can mean different things. We use it very casually, like, I'm having anxiety right now, like meaning just I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed. Or we can even use it to describe the physical sensation that happens in our body when our stress response system is activated, which happens when something big and important is coming up. It happens when we sense danger, and that also happens when we feel threatened in some way. And so sometimes it's when we feel angry. Like sometimes anger is really the manifestation of anxiety because we feel like something that we wanted to control is slipping away from us, or we feel powerless. It's just an important thing to be aware of.
I'm really curious about the vocabulary we use around anxiety because I feel like I don't even remember using the word very much growing up, that we
Mm-hmm.
didn't really talk about it. We talked about stress or being nervous or being worried, but I don't remember ever using that to describe myself or people around me. And maybe that's the bubble I was in, but it seems like it's something we talk about more
Mm-hmm.
lately. What is a healthy way to use the term anxiety, and how do you feel about taking that on as part of your identity as like, I have anxiety?
Mm-hmm. I think that it is true that some people struggle more with anxiety than others, and
Uh-huh.
it's important to have that self-awareness and recognize it. But as somebody who works in the anxiety space, I sometimes have tried to join different like anxiety groups, partly just to get a sense for what people are talking about and dealing with. But I feel like some of those spaces are actually kind of cementing in the anxiety identity. It's like
Right.
staying in this, like commiserating in this anxiety space. And so when my clients talk about like I'm anxious, I really challenge them on that because it's like saying I am anxious. Like, are
Yeah.
you anxious? Anxious is you? Is that really true? Anxious and anxiety and stress and overwhelm, they are feelings that come over us. They're like waves that pass, they come, they pass. And it's true that some people, they carry a baseline anxiety with them all the time.
Uh-huh.
And so with the people I work with, I help them identify, you know, what level of anxiety, and if we're going to call it anxiety, this sense of like vigilance perhaps, like what level of that do you need to keep yourself motivated and safe? Because we have stress and a stress response and a sympathetic nervous system for a reason. Like it's for survival and it's our
Yeah.
friend. But there's a certain point after which it becomes unhelpful and unhealthy. And so it's recognizing like what percent or degree of this do you want and need to hold on to? And then what can you let go of? And so I really try to help my clients and patients, recognize that emotions are valuable. They always have messages, but they do not equal us, and they are transient, and we can modify our relationship to them. And a lot of the
Yeah.
work becomes like actually an externalization or a separation between ourselves and that identity, because it doesn't have to be us.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen, and again, I don't fully understand, so I don't want to be judgmental at all, but I have
Mhm.
seen people who have taken that on as an identity, and
And
then it
it's
becomes
true.
limiting.
And it's true that, some people truly do have this as part of their pervading experience. And
Yeah.
when you don't relate to that, then it's hard to understand how difficult even just like going out of the house might be, or
Right.
running an errand, or, you know, like as a child with social anxiety, or, general anxiety, like to speak up to order at a restaurant. Like these things can be terrifying,
Yeah.
but it all becomes a choice of, but then what? Like
Yeah.
we can choose where our safety bubble is drawn. And we do have to secure our own well-being. And it may be wise for a certain individual to say, this activity is not worth what level of anxiety or stress it causes in me. And we all have the freedom to make those choices. So, for example, when I was a teenager, I didn't get very much driving practice. We just had one car. My mom just usually drove me around. And I, again, as kind of like an anxious person, I was scared to practice driving. And I actually didn't really learn to drive. And then I went to college and, I had a license, but I didn't really practice much. I went to college and again, I didn't have a car there and I walked everywhere I went. I didn't need to drive. But then I got married and then I needed to do things that were like adult things and be independent and have more responsibility, getting myself to a job. And only at that time did it matter enough to me to face those feelings, those somatic sensations that would come up in my body that I had to overcome to kind of get to the other side of that goal. And so I think we have to be very compassionate with ourselves and with others to let people make those choices for themselves of what is really worth it to them to push through and get to the other side of, and what isn't. But also to really empower people to see that it is possible to push through and to redefine where the line is. Yeah. To be able to face and open themselves up to more healthy risk-taking activities that will really bring growth. And we do have to ask ourselves an initial question, like when we feel anxiety, is there anything that immediately needs to be done for me to be safe? Because sometimes we actually do need to respond immediately to something and get ourselves out of a situation. You don't want to be standing on a high ledge being like, okay, I just need to meditate. I'm feeling anxious for some reason here. I just have to, get that anxiety down. It's like, no, get off the ledge. Yeah. So that's the first step.
This part of our conversation really reframed the whole way I think of anxiety. I love that idea of the ratio of risk over resources. So the next thing I wanted to know is, what are those resources? What are some of the tools we can use to help anxious kids?
The traditional approach to anxiety, it's like, okay, you have two options. Do you want to be on a medication or do you want to do therapy? Yeah. And these are helpful options. Like, I do prescribe medication to some of my patients who have anxiety. I do refer some of my patients to ongoing therapy. But those are not the only options. And in fact, if we only use one or both, we are missing out on so many other ways that we can affect our own well-being. And so some of the skills that I teach include really catching our thoughts, teaching the kids cognitive behavioral therapy strategies. So it's not just somebody else, guiding them in their thoughts, but actually teaching them to hold in their hand the way to make decisions about their own thoughts and the validity of their own thoughts. And teaching mindfulness tools, teaching the power of imagery and metaphor, teaching a lot of body strategies like how to use yoga therapeutically, like the way we move our body can take us from one emotional state to another. Using biofeedback, where we can actually measure certain things like our heart rate variability to train ourselves to get into a calm state. Also, things like tapping, which is kind of an energy medicine kind of technique, where you tap on acupressure points. And I have a certain way that I teach it for kids to help them process emotions. And then the spirit, that's the area that often we neglect. We don't even talk about this, and a lot of providers feel they can't talk about this. But I think that is part of our being. And when I talk about spirit, I mean things that bring us meaning, purpose, and connection.
Okay.
And this is often, very individualized to the person, but it's giving kids permission to really connect with ways that they can express themselves, like through music and art, and connecting with the things that they love. So how many of us are stuck in almost like this hamster wheel of existence where,
Yeah.
we just wake up in the morning, and this can apply to parents and kids, but, we get ready for where we need to go. And then we go to that place and we do things based on what other people are telling us to do. Then we come home and, like, if you're a kid, then you do homework, and then you go to a lesson or a sports practice. And then, maybe you have a little bit of time that is not prescribed. And then, you eat a meal, you go to bed, then it starts all over the next day. And where are our kids having a chance to play and express and be?
And explore who they are and what they actually
Yes.
want to be doing.
Right. And I think with that, I will say really quick that I always go back to some of the foundational principles of wellness of, our nutrition, our movement, our sleep, and our intentional use of technology. Because a lot of the development of identity, morals, values, dreams, a lot of that happens when we are not doing anything. And we really aren't leaving time for that. And many of our kids, when they ever have a down moment, then they're on a device.
Yeah.
And so we are taking out that time. It's called the default mode network. That is the brain space is used when we're like daydreaming or even bored. And sometimes as parents, we don't have a lot of toleration for our kids' boredom. And that makes us anxious when our kids are bored and they're like looking to us to entertain them or wanting a device. But our kids don't need to be entertained every second. When will they figure out who they are, what they want, what they believe?
And it's hard to convince them of that.
Right.
Not only ourselves. And now we've come to the annoying but inevitable part of any parenting episode where we remember that the best way to teach our kids is by example. This can be a lot of pressure. But Mary has such a refreshing take on this. And she has great advice for addressing our own anxiety.
Mental health of children always begins with mental health of parents. Dr. Dan Siegel has said that a child's emotional health is directly related to the parent's self-awareness. And when parents are unhappy in their lives and in their parenting role, it does impact the family. And in some ways that can feel like a weight, like one more thing to feel bad about or to feel anxious about. But really, it's more of a permission slip. It's a permission slip to say you can take some time to do the inner work to help yourself be more grounded and steady as you come to parenting. And as somebody who works a lot with mental health, I love the cycle, and I often draw this on the whiteboard in my clinic. Thoughts leading to feelings, leading to behaviors, leading to results, which then feed again into thoughts, and it goes on and on. And sometimes the best points of intervention really begins with our thoughts and what our expectations are for ourselves as parents, what our expectations are for our kids. And I think sometimes it's really helpful to go back to that.
I love that concept because I think some of our parents or their parents come from this tradition where maybe the parent kind of subjugates their own health and self-care, especially to the needs of the children, and they don't see the connection between the two.
Yes. And we know so much more now, too, about the idea of mirror neurons and co-regulation, that really our kids, in some ways, are a mirror of our own psyche and our own mental health. And as we can show up in a state that is grounded and steady, then that really gives them a safe place to grow and flourish. I think it's helpful to think about, what are we thinking about as moms? Like, what are we thinking about? And a lot of times anxiety comes when there's a dissonance, when we see that something is happening different than what we are expecting or wanting or needing. And so rather than just thinking about like, oh, I'm anxious, how do I calm this feeling? Sometimes we actually just have to get to the root and say, what message is in this anxiety? What do I need to change? What is needing to be set right? And I think as a mom, I realized that I couldn't show up to parenting in the way that I needed to if I was in a state of discontent. That, always, wishing to be somewhere else, wanting to be doing something, wanting things to be different than they were. And so I think it's just freedom and an invitation to really get honest and quiet with ourselves and say, what do we want? And what do we want for ourselves? What do we want for our families? And sometimes, I mentioned at the beginning that I consider myself a multi-passionate person. Like, so I have a lot of goals. I have a lot of dreams. I have a lot of things that I love to do. And sometimes as a mom, I feel disconnected from some of those things because,
time.
There is there's a lot, there's a lot, and you give so much to kids, and you can't do it all at the same time. And, but yet we need to do enough of those things that give us joy and a deep sense of satisfaction to be able to show up with happiness to our mothering life. And a lot of that I've found comes from, recognizing which things are non-negotiables and how to place them in my schedule in a way that works, and sometimes it's like, you don't even need tons of it. Even just like, it's almost like salt, like you just need a pinch of it sometimes. Or, some of the things can just be incorporated in the day. Being very honest with ourselves of what we truly want to be doing in a given moment. And as much as possible, responding. How often do we as parents, like, we're doing dishes and we really don't want to be doing dishes. We want to be doing something else. Like our kids are saying, Mom, come play with me. And we're like, I want to play with you, but I have to do this,
Yeah.
But what if we just walked away from the dishes and played for a little while, Or what if at those moments when our kids are like, come and play this pretend game with me, and we're like inside, like, oh, I need to do the dishes because, people are going to be coming over, and just to say, you know what, I do want to play with you, but right now I really need to do the dishes, and that's what I feel like I need to do. So I'm going to ask you to play with yourself for a minute, or come do the dishes with me,
Yeah.
And as a pediatrician, I had a lot of moms who were in the position of deciding if they wanted to go back to work. And some of them would come to me and say, I have to go back to work and I really don't want to. And I would say to them, well, do you really have to? Are there creative solutions here? Or there are moms saying, I feel like I need to be staying home and I'm feeling so depressed and stifled and I hate this. And, and they need to respond to that too. Like,
right.
And so I think one big way to heal one layer of anxiety is to be honest and authentic with ourselves about what we really need and want in a given moment. And as far as possible, try to create that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That is, and I think that's something that maybe people don't recognize the association between that
Mm-hmm.
and anxiety. And that's eye-opening to me.
Several years ago, I kind of had this existential crisis as I was finishing residency. I had just had my fourth child, and
Oh my
I had
goodness.
I had decided that I wanted to mostly be a stay-at-home parent and work just part-time. And all of a sudden, I had so many hours at home, and I was like, what's my role here? What is the
Yeah.
most important thing for me to be doing? And, I had read so many parenting books. I knew about child development. I knew about all the theories. But in some ways that just made me feel paralyzed, because it seemed like any direction I went, any step I took was violating some parenting recommendation. Because,
Yes, because
and
they're often opposed.
right. And also, like, I would read parenting books and feel like maybe there was a piece of it that really resonated, but then some of it didn't quite settle with me, and so I couldn't quite find the answer. And so really I went on this quest to figure out what is my main role as a parent. And that led me to really become a student of motherhood, and,
Yeah.
and a couple years ago I was able to give a TEDx talk, and it was entitled Compassion Parenting, Transcending the Myth of Perfect Conditions.
Ah,
And it is talking about how sometimes we feel like our job is different than it really is. We think our job is to secure these perfect conditions for our kids and to make sure our kids are constantly, comfortable, happy, in the best of everything. But that's not really what our job is ultimately. I think,
yeah, that's not real life.
right, right. And so what I came to, and what I really believe, is that our job is to take responsibility for the way we show up. And the phrase that I came up with to describe this ideal state that I wanted to show up with was grounded, loving presence. And so suddenly, instead of trying to do all the things, make sure everything was organized, clean, that the kids were getting to every possible enrichment, I suddenly just started focusing on how I showed up. And that really ties into my work with anxious kids, because I do a lot of work with these kids who are these very high performing kids. They're under a lot of chronic stress, and they're trying to do all the things. They're trying to get scholarships. They're maybe athletes and musicians and dancers, but they're sometimes just really struggling with their mental health.
Yeah.
You'd think like, okay, these kids have it all, but they're not happy. And maybe they're not performing to their potential because of their mental health state. And really, I see that what often happens is that we as parents, we try to modify the environment around our kids, when instead, if we could help to resource our kids and help them to build resilience and these factors of emotional intelligence, then they can really, with wisdom, capitalize on all the opportunities around them.
And that's one of my favorite takeaways from this conversation. Focusing our efforts on building our kids' resilience rather than trying to change their environment. Equipping them with resources that will help them do hard things, whatever that looks like for them. I loved this conversation so much, and if you did too, you might want to check out a few other related episodes, which I'll link to in the show notes. First, how Chantel Allen manages anxiety, and also how she takes care of herself, part 1 and part 2. In the next episode of How She Moms, I'll be doing another one of my How Whitney Experiments episodes, focusing on how we gather our family and friends, with lots of great tidbits from the fabulous book The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. Thanks for listening to this episode of the How She Moms podcast. If you enjoyed it, share it with a friend or two. And if you can't get enough of How She Moms, head over to howshemoms.com and sign up for my monthly newsletter, where I talk about experiments we're trying here at the Archibald House, give you ideas for experiments and activities you can do with your own families, and share other deep and shallow thoughts about motherhood. Special thanks to my mom, Susan Singley, for recording the theme music for my podcast. She used to play this song all the time when I was growing up, and to me, it's the soundtrack of motherhood.